The night of the 5th of June into the 6th, 1944. A German sentry stands at the edge of a flooded field in the lowlands behind what the Allies have, named Utah Beach, on the Cotentin Peninsula of Normandy. He belongs to a static division, the kind of unit the German army built out of older men, foreign conscripts, and soldiers it had stopped expecting much from. He has been told one thing about the ground in front of him, and he believes it, because he can see it. The field is a lake. It is not supposed to be a lake. A season ago, it was pasture for dairy cattle. German engineers opened a lock near the mouth of the Douve River, let the tide flood in, and shut it behind the water so it could not drain. Now, a sheet of black water reaches from his boots to the next hedgerow, ankle deep in places, over a man's head in others, and it sits exactly where his commanders want it. The water is a wall. No tank crosses it. No truck crosses it. The reasoning runs that if the Americans come, they will come the way Americans have come before, in daylight, along the handful of raised causeways that cross the marsh, slow and loud and visible. And the machine guns, sighted down the hedgerows, will take them apart in the open. So he has time. The doctrine says he has time. The doctrine is very good, and it has been correct for most of the war. Then after midnight, the western sky fills with light. Flak, his own sides, reaching up at a sound he has never heard in this volume, the drone of many hundreds of aircraft at once. A plane comes apart in the air. White canopies open below it, a few, then dozens, then more than he can count, drifting down into the dark fields and the flooded ground and the apple orchards. They are coming down behind him. Not onto the causeways where he is looking, but into the country at his back. Before we go on, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if you're loving this story, subscribe, because tomorrow we have something extra special waiting for you. In the small hours, he starts to hear something he cannot name. A short metallic snap out in the hedgerows. Click-clack, a pause. Then click-clack in answer. It is not a rifle bolt, and it is not a weapon at all. It moves through the dark, one snap answered by two, and he has no way to tell from the sound whether it is one man crawling or a dozen. By the time the light comes up gray, there are Americans in the orchard behind his position, and Americans on the road the flood was meant to protect. The lake had done its work. It had drowned men, real men, dragged under by the weight of their own equipment in water that did not reach their chests. And the lake had also failed, completely, because the enemy did not respect the wall, did not arrive where he was supposed to arrive, and was now on the dry side of the water, behind the guns, in numbers nobody could fix. That morning and across the days after it, German officers wrote up what they had seen. The reports said, in different words, the same thing. We do not understand how they got behind us. There was no line to hold. What follows is an account of how that happened. How a killing ground that one of the finest defensive armies in the world had flooded on purpose, fortified with hedgerows, and pre-sighted for slaughter was taken apart in a single night. The men who crossed it were not supermen, and no miracle was involved. By an airborne assault that went so badly wrong it scattered thousands of men into precisely the shape, the German defense had no answer. And by a small brass noisemaker built partly from the scrap tin of a candy factory. And the men who saw the change most clearly were the ones lying in the hedgerows, looking down their sights for a target that refused to behave. There is a habit when the Allies win of treating every German preparation in Normandy as a fortification that was always going to fall. The flooding of the Cotentin deserves better than that, because as engineering and as tactics, it was a genuinely good idea, and for one terrible stretch of that night, it worked better than its designers could have hoped. The Cotentin is low, wet country drained by two rivers, the Douve and its tributary the Murdere, both sluggish and prone to spilling over their banks. The German commander in Normandy, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, understood what that meant. On his orders, the lock at La Barquette, near the mouth of the Douve just above the town of Carentan, was opened at high tide to let the sea push inland, then closed at low tide to trap the water on the fields. The result was a deliberate inundation that ran for miles. from south of Volognes down toward Carentan and Iceny, drowning the valleys under water that reached 2 meters deep in places. Britannica, describing the same landings, notes in one flat sentence that the troops dropping into that deliberately flooded zone took heavy losses to drowning. That is the cost of the idea, stated plainly. The flood was the centerpiece of a wider plan that was, on paper, sound. Off Utah Beach, there were only a few raised causeways leading inland across the marsh. Hold those. And an entire seaborne corps could be bottled up on the sand with nowhere to drive its tanks. So, the American airborne plan was built to take the causeways and the river crossings before the Germans could lock them shut. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles under Major General Maxwell Taylor, would drop behind Utah and seize the western exits of the causeways. The 82nd, the All-American Division under Major General Matthew Ridgway, would land around the Murderay and hold the stone bridges at La Fière and Chef du Pont, the only crossings that mattered. Waiting for them was a mixed bag of defenders. The eastern side of the peninsula, including Utah, belonged to the 709th Static Infantry Division. The west coast was held by the 243rd. Both were weak. Between them sat the 91st Luftland Division, air landing formation that had only arrived in May, and the 6th Parachute Regiment, German paratroopers who would turn out to be the hardest men on the field. The defense leaned on the terrain to make up for the quality of the troops, and the terrain was made for it. The Bocage was a lattice of small irregular fields, pasture and apple orchard, each one boxed in by an earth embankment 3 to 15 feet high, packed with roots, and crowned with hedge so thick a man could not see through it, or easily climb it. Every field was a separate compartment. To move from one to the next, you found a gap, or you cut one, usually while someone was shooting at you. For a defender, it was close to ideal. A single machine gun behind a hedgerow could hold a field, and the gunner could not be seen until he fired. The whole arrangement rested on one assumption, and it was a reasonable assumption in early 1944. The Germans expected the Americans to fight the way they had seen Americans fight by day, behind artillery, channeled onto the roads and the causeways, because the flooded fields gave armor and trucks nowhere else to go. Drown the ground, sight the hedges, wait for daylight, and let the attacker walk into the open. It was a good plan for the attack the Germans were expecting. It was the wrong plan for the one that came. Measured against its own plan, the American airborne assault on the Cotentin was close to a disaster. That is not a dramatic reading, it is what the numbers say. Something over 13,000 paratroopers of the two divisions were loaded into roughly 1,000 C-47 transports in England on the evening of the 5th. Each man carried an absurd load. Accounts of the jump put the weight at more than 100 pounds for many troopers, and well past that for some, between 125 and 150 pounds of parachute, reserve, weapon, ammunition, rations, and tools strapped to one body. The lead drops went in just after midnight. The 101st run, Operation Albany, began around 20 past 12. The 82nd, Operation Boston, started a little over an hour later. Then the plan came apart in the air. As the transport columns crossed the peninsula, they ran into thick cloud and then into German anti-aircraft fire, and the formation scattered. Pilots, who had never flown through flak, broke their tight serials. Some switched on the green jump light early, before they had reached the drop zones at all, simply to get their men out of a burning sky. Paratroopers jumped seconds or minutes too late and came down miles from where they were meant to be. By the most cited figures, more than 3/4 of the men landed outside their assigned drop zones. Some came down as much as 25 miles from Sainte-Mère-Église. Gliders following them in pancaked into hedgerows and buildings, or settled into the Murderette marshes. Around 60% of the equipment dropped that night, the mortars and radios and ammunition that lightly armed paratroopers depended on, was lost in the dark and the water took men. This is the part the planners had not put a number to. Loaded down past 100 pounds, a man who came down in a flooded field could not stand, could not shed his harness fast enough, could not get his head above a surface that in many places was less than a meter deep. He drowned in a pasture. John Taylor, a trooper of the 101st, remembered it without any decoration. The men who jumped from his aircraft ahead of him drowned in a marsh, and so did the men who jumped after. He himself happened to land on a thin strip of dry ground a few meters wide that ran through the flood, and that strip of luck is the only reason his account exists. The disarray was total. By the middle of the morning, 4,000 men of the 82nd were still unaccounted for. A full day after the jump, only about 2,500 of the 101st 6,000 were under the direct control of their own division headquarters. The rest were dead, captured, drowned, or scattered in twos and threes across a countryside they could not navigate, behind an enemy who held the roads. By every standard a planner would use, this was a failure. And it is here that the strangest thing about the night shows itself, because the very scattering that wrecked the plan also wrecked the German ability to understand what was being done to them. A tidy, concentrated drop is an arrow on a map. An intelligence officer can look at it and read the intention. A drop flung in fragments across half a peninsula is not an arrow. It is noise in every direction at once, and noise cannot be countered because it cannot be located. Small knots of paratroopers, many of them strangers thrown together from different regiments, began doing damage wherever they happened to be. The 505th Parachute Infantry took Saint-Mère-Église in the dark, the first French town liberated on D-Day, and cut the main telephone cable running to the German fortress at Cherbourg. One trooper, John Steele, spent the assault hanging from the church steeple by his snagged canopy, is the kind of detail that survives precisely because almost nothing went according to plan. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The problem of the scattered men had been foreseen, at least in part, and the answer to it was almost comically small. A year earlier, during the airborne drop into Sicily, Maxwell Taylor had watched paratroopers come down dispersed and then expose themselves trying to find one another in the dark, calling out, moving toward voices that might or might not be friendly. He came away convinced his men needed a way to ask friend or foe at night without using their mouths. The solution was a noisemaker based on a children's toy, a strip of sprung steel riveted into a small brass body that gave a sharp double snap when you pressed and released it. The order went to the Acme Company in Birmingham, England, the firm best known for the referee's whistle, and it was treated as a secret. Wartime shortages meant the metal had to come from wherever it could be found, and some of the crickets were stamped from repurposed tin, including packaging scrounged from a nearby Cadbury chocolate factory. The little brass clickers were handed out in the last days before the invasion. Some passed to the men as they boarded the aircraft. The system was deliberately stupid, because stupid is what survives stress at 3 in the morning. 1 click was a challenge. 2 clicks in reply meant friend. No reply, or the wrong reply, meant you were listening to a German, and you acted accordingly. A spoken backup ran alongside it, the challenge word flash answered by thunder for the first day, changing to hustle and along on the second. Only the 101st carried the crickets. The 82nd relied on the words alone. The cricket deserves an honest description, because it was not a magic key. A click in the dark was a gamble, and there were Germans on the far side of more than one hedgerow gate. But in flooded orchard country, where a sentence of spoken English could draw a machine gun burst toward your voice, a sound that any toy could make let scattered, frightened men reassemble into fighting groups without announcing their nationality to everyone within earshot. That is the literal silent movement the German reports kept circling around, not ghosts gliding through the reeds. Small parties of soldiers finding each other by a snap of tin, forming up out of the chaos, and moving off through gaps in the hedges before the defenders understood a unit had even gathered. The men who clicked their way back together in that darkness did not do it for a monument. and most of them never got one. A tap on the like button on this video is a small thing, but it pushes their story toward the people who care how it actually happened. Instead of the tidy version that fits on a plaque, it costs you nothing, and it is the cheapest, honest way to keep them visible. The German confusion that night was not the confusion of stupid men. The Cotentin was held under a command system that should have functioned, run by professional officers who had spent years at war. What happened to them is more instructive than simple failure, because it shows what the scattered drop did to an organization that was trying hard to respond. It began with a decapitation that nobody planned. Major General Wilhelm Fahle commanded the 91st Luftland Division, the formation positioned specifically to deal with airborne landings center of the peninsula. Woken by the chaos, Fahle raced back toward his headquarters by car in the dark, and on the grounds of the headquarters he drove straight into paratroopers of the 82nd, who shot him dead. He was the first German general to die in Normandy. The division most responsible for fighting the airborne had lost its commander to the airborne before the sun came up. Above him, at the Lexiv Corps headquarters in Saint-Lô, General Erich Marx was trying to assemble a picture out of fragments, and the fragments lied to him. Reports came in just after midnight that Allied paratroopers had landed south of Carentan. Marx committed his only corps reserve, a battle group under Colonel Meyer, to chase the problem down. Meyer had his grenadiers on the road by 3 in the morning, and then the night swallowed them, because moving a battle group along narrow Norman lanes in the dark was slow, hard work. They were still on the road at 6 in the wrong place entirely when the sun rose, and the Allied invasion fleet appeared off the coast. Around 7, a fresh report reached Marx and corrected the first one. There had been no drop south of Carentan after all. The whole thing had been a rumor, a jumpy patrol, perhaps a typing error on a message. The reserve had spent the decisive hours of the invasion marching against a place where nothing was happening. A single reconnaissance flight would have cleared it up in 10 minutes, except that no German aircraft were over the battlefield, because that sky now belonged to other people. The orders that did go out show a command swinging at shadows. Records compiled by the U.S. Army's own staff-write historians have the Corps, before 3 in the morning, sending one regiment and a handful of captured French tanks to clear the west bank of the Meurthe, and another regiment driving down from Montebourg towards Sainte-Mère-Église to destroy what the Germans believed was the American main effort. There was no main effort to destroy. There were paratroopers in 100 places and a concentration in none. One German account quoted in that same study compared the experience to being among a swarm of maddened bees. For the men in the hedgerows, the snipers and machine gun crews who were supposed to be the teeth of this defense, the effect was personal and disorienting. A sniper is trained to read a front and to prioritize targets, the officer first, then the sergeant, then the gunner. That training assumes there is a front, a direction the enemy comes from, and an enemy who looks like a formation. On the Cotentin that night there was no front. The Americans came out of the flooded ground that the maps marked impassable. They came from the rear, in pairs and threes that gave away no rank and no plan, finding each other by a sound like a toy. And they were behind the guns before there was anything to aim at. The wall of water that was meant to channel the attack into the open had become a curtain the attackers had simply appeared through. If your father or your grandfather jumped into Normandy with the 82nd or the 101st, or came ashore behind them, and fought up through this drowned country, the comments under this video are the right place for it. What was his unit? What did he tell you if he told you anything at all? Those accounts are the actual record, and they outlast the textbooks. The flooded Bocage did not stay quiet for long, and the cost of taking it apart was paid in full a few days later on a raised road outside Carentan. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole commanded the 3rd Battalion of the 502nd Parachute Infantry, part of the 101st. He was a tall Texan, West Point class of 1939, the son of an army doctor, and after the scattered jump, he had done what every competent paratrooper officer did that week. He gathered whatever men he could find from whatever units they belonged to and pushed on toward his objective. By the 10th and 11th of June, his battalion was advancing on Carentan along a causeway raised above the flooded marsh, with the last bridges into the town at the far end. The men later named the road Purple Heart Lane. The Germans were dug in behind a hedgerow around a farmhouse, perhaps 150 yards off, and they had the causeway zeroed. Cole's battalion was pinned against the embankment by rifle, machine gun, mortar, and artillery fire. And it stayed pinned for over an hour while the casualties mounted and nothing moved. What Cole did is the whole argument of this story compressed into a few minutes. He understood that staying on that road meant dying on it by inches. He called for a smoke screen, ordered his men to fix bayonets, and then he stood up in front of his battalion with his pistol drawn and ordered them forward into the fire. It was a ragged start. A handful of men rose with him, then more, and the charge built until the battalion was up and across the open ground and into the German positions with the bayonet. It is often described as the first battalion-scale bayonet charge by American forces in the war. It worked, and it was savage. Cole had begun the causeway fight with several hundred men. By the time it was over, his battalion had been cut roughly in half. So, the verdict. The title over this video says, German snipers were stunned that the Americans moved silently through the flooded Bocage. And the honest version is both less magical and harder to forget. The night was not silent. It was deafening. Full of flak and burning aircraft, and men drowning in the dark in water that should not have been deep enough to kill them. The silence in the German reports was a different thing. It was the silence of a defensive line waking up to find the enemy already inside the wire, behind the guns, with no formation to fire on and no front to defend. The flood that was supposed to be a wall drowned its share of Americans and still failed at the one job it had been given, because the men it was meant to stop had been scattered by accident and by disaster to exactly the formation it could not handle, because they could find each other in the dark with a brass clicker, and because officers like Cole would not let them stop. None of that makes the American supermen, and the German soldier in the hedgerow was not a coward or a fool. He was a professional defending a position built on a sound assumption, and the assumption was simply wrong for one night. That is usually how these things turn, not on courage against cowardice, on whose picture of the battle matched the battle. Robert Cole received the Medal of Honor for the charge on Purple Heart Lane. He did not live to be handed it. 3 months later, in September of 1944, during the airborne operation in the Netherlands, he was directing aircraft onto German positions and stepped out to lay orange identification panels in front of his men so the pilots could see where the Americans were. He raised his head for a moment to look up at the plane. A German sniper in a farmhouse around 300 yards away fired one round and killed him. The medal was approved 2 weeks later. He was 29. The sniper at the end of Cole's story is the same figure who opened this one. The man behind the scope, who could not quite believe what he was watching in the flooded fields of Normandy. By the autumn, the puzzle had a clearer answer, and the German army never managed to write a good counter to it before the war rolled over them. The men who solved that drowned ground in a single chaotic night were not numbers. They had names and units and people waiting for them at home, and they earned the right to be remembered as they actually were, scattered, soaked, frightened, and unstoppable. If this forensic breakdown was worth your time, the like button helps it reach the people who want the history straight. Subscribe if you want the next one, because there are more nights like this one whose real story is still owed. They had names. They deserve to be remembered by them. That's our story. If you enjoyed it, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell. And tomorrow, more stories are waiting for you. Thanks for watching.